Remember from a couple weeks ago, all this is what we call a retribution theology. It's all about God punishes the wicked and he blesses the righteous. So if you're being punished, if you're going through some kind of heartache, it's because you deserved it, because God is giving you what you deserve, kind of thing. All the friends have that same attitude. Job has that same attitude. Satan even has that same attitude. Except they approach it differently. They have a different foundation for why they argue what they argue. And so Job in chapter 7 is going to respond. Look at the first 6 verses in Job chapter 7. Because the rest of Job's response is more like a soliloquy. It's more like just an inner dialogue that he's having with himself that turns into more of a remonstration against God himself. And his theme in chapter 7, Job's theme is, there are hard things on earth that are undergone by good people. That man is born and we go through difficulties. That's what life is. That's what Job is going to talk about in Job chapter 7. So look at verse 1 and we'll read the first 6. Is not man forced to labor on earth, and are not his days like the days of a hired man? As a slave who pants for the shade, and as a hired man who eagerly waits for his wages. So am I allotted months of vanity, and nights of trouble are appointed me. When I lie down, I say, when shall I rise? But the night continues, and I'm continually tossing until dawn. My flesh is clothed with worms and a crust of dirt. My skin hardens and runs. My days are swifter than a weaver's shuttle, and come to an end without hope. So, again, this is Job saying, I'm miserable. I'm suffering miserably. And Job's his whole idea, his whole thought is, all mankind does this. We all suffer because that's what life is. Look at verse 3, for example. Verse 3 implies something for us. Job says, I'm allotted months of vanity and nights of trouble. In other words, Job is implying it's been going on for a while. I've been suffering for a while. This is just part of life. And so in his complaint, Job is going to compare himself to a slave or a hired servant. And Job, his conclusion is, I'm worse than they are. My allotted punishment in life is worse than a slave or hired servant, because in Job's mind, Job's thinking, I'm righteous, I'm doing right, and so I'm being punished, and so my life is actually worse than theirs. So then he turns to verse 7. Verse 7 through verse 21 is kind of how this ends, and we'll talk about Esau's section in particular. But from verse 7 to verse 21 is a prayer. And a lot of Job's dialogue is prayer. He's praying, and he's going to teach us kind of the value of doing that. And so in those, from verse 7 to verse 21, Job shows us something. And what he shows us is, in all of his suffering, he never turns away from God. He blames God a lot, and he fusses at God, but he doesn't turn from him. And there's a difference between being upset and being aggravated that God is allowing you to experience hardship. There's a difference in that and even fussing at him, rather than turning your back on him. And Job never does that. And so in these verses, he's going to pray. And here's to me maybe one of the foundational things of life as a Christian. Job is going to keep talking to God. He just has no idea what to ask him. He has no idea what to say. He wants to talk. I think that's why Paul put it in Romans that when our words escape us, that the Holy Spirit knows and he converts our groanings into prayer for God. Because there's sometimes where we want to talk to him, we just don't know what to say. We don't know what to express or how to express it. And so Job is going to pray right here. And in his prayer, I believe that part of talking to God is what allows Job to maintain his sanity. This is what keeps him sane through all this, is at least he can still talk to the Lord. And so I contrast that to people that abandon God, to kind of lose their grip on reality a little bit, because at least if we're talking to the Lord, even if we're fussing, even if we're complaining, at least we have a grip on who he is. We have some kind of mooring for our faith, and Job kept that. So look at verses 7 through 10, and look at what he says. Remember that my life is but breath. In other words, Job believed he's going to die soon. That's what he's expressing. I think my life is about to be over. Now, notice how it changes from chapter 3. Chapter 3, he wishes that he would die. Chapter 7, he doesn't wish that. He just believes it's going to happen, but he's not wishing it anymore. He just thinks that the time is the time's running out for him. Now, this signifies kind of an upturn in feelings for Job. Things have changed for him. What changed for him? I think it's his praying. I think him praying changed his outlook. It's not that, in chapter 3, he's sitting in silence for 7 days. He's just thinking about all this stuff. And then when his friends come up, they're all sitting around. And then Job says, hey, you know what? In my raw just anger and being upset, it probably been better had I never been born. Now you contrast that to chapter 7. In chapter 7, he actually starts talking to God. And his feelings change. He's not saying, God, I wish I'd never been born. He says, God, I think my time's up. I think it's probably an end. Because remember, he's sick. His body's covered in sores. He's miserable. He's suffering. So he thinks his time's up. But by talking to God, he understands that things are... he feels a little more secure because he has God with him. So this is verse 7 through 10. My life is but breath. My eye will not see see good. The eye on him who sees me will behold me no longer. And he just goes on and on and on, letting us know that at least he's dialogue. At least he's talking. Look at verse 11. Verse 11 through 21, again, Job changes. All this is a prayer, but in the prayer, he starts to address his friends. Verse 11, therefore I will not restrain my mouth. I will speak in anguish of my spirit. I will complain in the bitterness of my soul. Am I the sea or the sea monster that you set a guard over me? If I say my bed will comfort me, my couch will ease my complaint, then you frighten me with dreams and terrify me by vision, so that my soul would choose suffocation. He goes on and on again. So now what he's doing is, do you remember? And again, we're 2 weeks out from talking about this. When Job's friends were sitting around, and Eliphaz, right before he starts to speak, actually right after he starts to speak, they start saying to Job, all right, Job, you sinned. You brought this on yourself. And then Job asked Eliphaz a really pointed question. He said, what sin did I commit? What did I do? Tell me what I did. Well, Eliphaz couldn't name it. He couldn't point out a sin. Now look how Job shifts in verses 11 through 21. The friends couldn't identify a sin. So now he asked God what he did. He said, okay, God, now you tell me. Because Job still has that same retribution attitude. Job still thinks, in his mind, Job thinks, I've been a good person, and I don't deserve what's happening to me. And so, even though he thinks he's been good and he doesn't deserve it, he still has this belief that God is going to punish the wicked. And so if I'm being punished, I must have done something. And Job says, I can't identify. I don't know what it is. My friends don't know what it is. So God, you tell me what I did. Tell me how I wronged you. Tell me how I messed up so that so maybe I can straighten this out. This is Job's prayer in verses 7 through 21. Some people are afraid to pray frankly and honestly to God. Some people are afraid to do that. And I don't know why. I don't know why you and I can't be honest before the one who knows all things. God knows your heart. God knows your motives. God knows your plans. God knows everything about you. But for some reason, I guess it's human nature, we can't come clean to him. We just can't say the words. It's like if I say the words, it becomes real, and I don't want to say the words. And so I'm convinced that people sit in churches all across the world every Sunday or every time they meet for worship, and their hearts are really beating out of their chests, and sin is really convicting them, and God's really getting a hold of them, but they refuse to come clean before him. They just won't admit it, The first step of any kind of recovery is admitting you have a problem. Job had nothing to hide. Job has, I mean, as we go through this, Job is going to respond to his friends, but more often than not, Job's response is to God himself. And when Job responds to God, he has nothing to hide. Most of the time, Job's response is anger. He's mad. He doesn't understand it. Because like it or not, you and I have the same kind of mentality. We don't really, just overtly admit it. We don't consciously say it. But we have the same mentality. We think deep down somewhere that if I'm good, if I go to church, if I pay my tithe, if I go to life group, if I sing in the choir, if I'm nice to my neighbor, then I'm going to be rewarded in this life. We have that attitude. And then we have the attitude that, these people are out that they're running the streets doing, God only knows what, acting crazy and living in sin, doing anything. Well, they're going to be punished and they're going to be hurt. We have that attitude. We have that. And so me and you, we don't know how to express it, but we get this feeling sometimes, I believe. I'm speaking for myself, I guess. I'm kind of trusting you're in the same boat. But we get this attitude sometimes of, I'm doing everything that I know to do right. I'm trying. I fail. I'm failing all the time, but at least I'm trying. And so why is this happening to me? I've told y'all before, one of the hardest things I've ever dealt with was when Will got diagnosed with autism. Will was 18 months old. Actually, he was 15 months old. He quit responding. He was progressing normally. I mean, everything was fine. He was talking. He was eating. He was saying words. He was doing everything. And then it just stopped. It just dead stopped. And we knew something was wrong. You still don't want to admit it. You don't want to say the word. So we go to the doctor, and he said, "Yeah, he's under the autism spectrum." And it's like a knife in my heart. It's like this can't be happening. And I don't like to admit it, but my first thought was, I go to church every single week. Not only do I go to church, but I sing in the choir. I'm leading the youth. I'm teaching kids. I'm doing everything. Why does this happen to me? Why happen to somebody else? That's not living right. It's not in church. And then if you start looking at Job's story, I had the same attitude they had. This retribution type thing, that God is going to bless you if you do right and punish you if you don't. And so Job understands. I mean, that's his mentality. That's his understanding of the world. And so when he comes clean to God, when he talks to God, it's this very raw, very honest reaction where Job is thinking, I don't think I did wrong. I think I've been living right, but yet you're punishing me. I can't figure out what I did wrong, so God, you have to tell me this. Now, Job reacts kind of hostilely to Eliphaz, partly because of the way his friend tried to comfort him. Eliphaz is the first one to speak. He comes along, and Eliphaz assumed a position of having superior knowledge over Job because of his experiences, because of his age, I guess. And he kind of forced Job into this mold of being a great sinner based on this retribution type idea. And Job didn't appreciate that. Job didn't appreciate his friend coming and kicking him while he was down. And so Job responds kind of hostilely. But then when Job starts responding to God, he pretty much does the same thing. And he just can't figure out why it is that God is hurting him like that. So now you go to chapter 8. Chapter 8 is Bildad. Bildad, this is his first speech. He comes along. It's the same attitude. It's the same idea. It's the same retribution type philosophy, except he approaches it different. And so he agrees with Eliphaz. They agree. And they both agree that God is paying back Job for something that Job had committed. And he believed that God would show Job mercy if Job just confessed the sin. Job, you did wrong, you sinned, and if you'll just confess it and come clean, God will help you out. He'll pull back the punishment. But Bildad approached it from a different foundation. Eliphaz argued from his own personal experience. These are things I've experienced. I've seen it, I've observed it, I know it. Bildad did something that I think we fall victim to a lot in modern churches. He bases his on tradition. Bildad is going to argue the same point, that God punishes the wicked, God blesses the righteous. But he says, my basis for this, my argument for this, is not based on things I've experienced, but based on past generations, based on traditions that I've seen, based on stories that I've heard. So if you label these two, Eliphaz is a existentialist, based on experience, and Bildad's a traditionalist. He thinks everything's based on tradition. So look at chapter 8, verses 1 and 2. Then Bildad the Shuhite answered, "How long will you say these things, and the word of your mouth be a mighty wind?" So Bildad's initial words contrast Eliphaz. Eliphaz was more gentle and indirect. Bildad is more impatient and insensitive. In other words, look at verse 2. How long are you going to... Basically, you understand the word. Here's the word we would use. How long will you say these things in the mouth, and the word of your mouth be a mighty wind? We'd say, how long are you going to be a blowhard? You're just talking. You're just pontificating about stuff, and you're not making any sense. How long are you going to do this? How long are you going to have this little pity party? Then he goes to verse 3. Does God pervert justice, or does the Almighty pervert what is right? If your sons sinned against him, then he delivered them into the power of their transgression. If you would seek God and implore the compassion of the Almighty, if you're pure and upright, surely now he would rouse himself for you and restore your righteous estate. Though your beginning was insignificant, yet your end will increase greatly. So here's Bildad's insensitivity. Look at the callous reference that he makes. He talks about Job's children. What happened to Job's children? They were all killed. And so I don't know if you picked this up in verses 3 through 7, but here's what he says. Does God pervert justice? No, he doesn't. And he says, let's look at your children. In other words, here's my paraphrase of this. They got what they deserved. That's what he's saying. This is a man that lost everything, that's suffering with sores all over his body, whose children were killed. And here's his friend that come up and said, how long are you just going to run your mouth like this? Your kids got what they deserved. That's pretty insensitive to me. That's not the way you come. Just FYI, it's not the way you comfort your friend that's hurting. All right, don't say that kind of stuff. And so Bildad asserts that God does not punish righteousness. Look at verse 6, and again in verse 20. God does. If you're righteous, God doesn't punish you. That's his assertion. That's what he's claiming. And so he makes an erroneous assumption, and he says that all suffering is punishment for sin, which is again that retribution dogma. It's that if you're being punished, then you deserve it. You sinned and you deserved it. Then he's going to give us a history lesson. Look at verse 8. Please inquire of past generations. This is our history lesson. Consider the things searched out by their fathers, for we are only of yesterday and know nothing. Look at verse 10. Will they not teach you and tell you and bring forth word from their minds? So Bildad's authority for this position, everything he's basing this on, his argument for what's happening to Job, the whole basis for this is spelled out real clear in this section. He says, look to the past. Look at what they did. Just to be honest with you, I mean, just to phrase this tactfully, there's a lot of heresies that are still being taught in churches that have long historical pedigrees. It's been around for a long time. But people are still teaching them just because it's tradition. It's the way we've always done it. And this is what's happening to Bildad. Bildad saying, hey, listen, I don't have to see anything or observe anything. This is written down in your forefathers. I mean, you just look at our history. It's happened. Then he goes to verse 11. And here's where he really attacks his friend. Again, this is the way not to do it. Can the papyrus grow up without a marsh? Can the rushes grow without water? while it's still green and not cut down. Yet it withers before any other plant. So are the paths of all who forget God, and the hope of the godless will perish, whose confidence is fragile, and whose trust is a spider's web. He trusts in his house, but it does not stand. He holds fast to it, but it does not endure. He thrives before the sun, and his shoots spread over his garden. His roots wrap around a rock pile. He grasps a house of stone. If he is removed from his place, then it will deny him, saying, I never saw you. Behold, this is the joy of his way, and out of the dust others will spring. Lo, God will not reject a man of integrity, nor will he support the evildoer. He will yet fill your mouth with laughter, and your lips with shouting. Those who hate you will be clothed with shame, and the tent of the wicked will be no longer. In other words, this is a direct insinuation of Job's godlessness. Look at verse 11 through 13. He gives us an illustration of a water plant. In Bildad's view, this is Bildad's opinion. Here's what verse 11 through 13 means. Job has abandoned God. And so since Job's abandoned God, God's the source of his blessing. Since you've abandoned God, there's no more blessing. And so we'll look at his advice. Don't forget God. Just don't forget God. Verse 14 through 15, he gives us a spider web analogy. And here's what he's talking about with his spider web. Again, he's attacking Job, and he's saying, Job, you're godless. Number one, you forgot God. You abandoned him, so God's pulled back his blessing. Number two, he gives us a spider web thing, and he's saying, Job, you've always relied on possessions more than God. And so since you put the possessions first, God has stripped you of those possessions to try to point you back to him. And so just turn back to him. Then in verse 16 through 19, he gives us an illustration of a garden plant. And that garden plant, it compared Job to an uprooted bush that other bushes would now replace. And so he in those 8 verses, he's saying to Job, Job, all this is your fault because you've been acting very godless. You've abandoned God, you've trusted possession, and God has uprooted you. You'll put other people in your place. Then in verse 20 through 22, he kind of gives him gives Job a reprieve or a way out. Verse 20, lo, God will not reject a man of integrity. So he's going to remind Job of God's integrity. Verse 21, he will yet fill your mouth with laughter, your lips with shouting. Those who hate you will be clothed with shame, blah, blah, blah. In other words, Job, I want to remind you that God has integrity. He's not going to abandon you if you stick with him. And so by saying all this and attacking Job like he's doing, he's hoping that he's going to convince his friend to repent. That's where he's going to get him to repent. I do admit that the book of Jude says that some you save by fire, some not. Some you got to be gentle with. But I would say if you're trying to lead somebody to the Lord or help them try to find repentance, it's probably not the way to do it. Just really go after them, and tell them how sorry they are. And so he says, if you'll repent, if you'll just come back, then God will restore the blessings to you. But the ball's in your court. So Bildad made a mistake. And because his arguments did not move Job, Job didn't get convinced by any of this kind of stuff. His mistake, he thought that just in these few simple words, he could explain the mysteries of human suffering. He's going to try to boil it all down into one little thing. And it just didn't work out that way. People with problems, real problems, they don't get help from rigid-minded modern-day Bildads. If somebody has a real serious problem, this is not the way to get through to them. This is not helpful. He thought it was because he thought, well, everything that we've had in our tradition backs this up. But that's not the way to do it. And I think that may be one of the reasons it's in here. Now if you look at verse 9, now Job gets to talk. This is Job's reply. And the most significant part of these 2 chapters, the most important part of it, is that Job has he shifted temporarily. His thinking has shifted. And he's not talking about sheer suffering and life denial. You know, I wish I was dead and all I'm doing is suffering anymore. Now he is contemplating the idea of vindication. You know, when is God actually going to step in for me? And so in chapter 9, verses 1 through 12, and I want to read these verses. I'm going to read the rest of this chapter, but I do want to read these verses because I think it's the key to Job's turning. In verse 1, Job answered, "In truth, I know this is so. But how can a man be in the right before God? If one wished to dispute with him, he could not answer him once in 1,000 times. Wise in heart and mighty in strength, who has defied him without harm? It is God who removes the mountains, they know not how, when he overturns them in his anger. Who shakes the earth out of its place, and its pillars tremble? Who commands the sun not to shine and sets a seal upon the stars? Who alone stretches out the heavens and tramples down the waves of the sea? Who makes the bear, Orion, and the Pleiades?" That's pretty impressive that Job is talking about modern astronomy in the patriarchal period. And the chambers of the south. Who does the great things unfathomable and wondrous works without number? So this is Job. Actually, let me read verse 11. Were he to pass by me, I would not see him. Were he to move past me, I wouldn't perceive him. Were he to snatch away, who could restrain him? Who could say to him, "What are you doing?" So Bildad's the second friend to go. And Bildad says, okay, I agree with Eliphaz. Except I can't base this on personal experience. I'm more of a traditionalist. Based on tradition, you deserve what you're getting. And then Job responds, and in the first 12 verses, he's talking about the greatness of God. And so he's shifted temporarily, because he's going to get back to this complaining, but temporarily he's shifted away from this idea of, oh, I'm suffering, I'm so pitiful, I'm now he's talking about God can vindicate me because God is righteous, God is strong. And so he says, I agree with you. God does not pervert what's true. He's not going to do that. And then Job turned to a question that Eliphaz asked him earlier. If you go back and look at chapter 4, verse 17, this question evidently stuck in Job's mind. Because Eliphaz asked him this. And here's what he asked him. How could a righteous man, much less an ungodly man, stand righteous before a holy God? That's the question he asked him. How can a righteous person, much less an unrighteous person, how can they stand before God? Because that's what Eliphaz told him to do. Eliphaz said, you got to stand righteous before God. And he said, how can I do that? And now this question kind of stuck with Job, and now he's asking it. And he's wanting to know, how can anybody, I mean, just look at our day, look at our generation, people around us, how can any one human being alive stand righteous before God? And then he starts talking about all this stuff. He's talking about Orion and the Pleiades and all these constellations in the sky. He says, God created these things. Who can stand righteous before him? Who's worthy to do that? And Job's answer is, because God is who he says he is, Job says, I can't go into court against him and win. I can't stand up to him. I can't refute him. I can't argue with him. I can't. It's useless for me to try that. And in Job lists 4 reasons why it's useless. Look at number 1 in verse 3 through 14. Job said, if I disputed with him, if we were in court, a court of law, and God makes an argument, and I argued with him, I couldn't answer him because he is so mighty. I can't answer him. I can't answer God. And then his second one is, he said, if God did respond to my cry, I don't think he would be listening because he's against me. You know, even if he did listen, evidently I'm wrong. Then number 3 in verses 20 through 24, Job said, if I'm righteous, God's going to declare me guilty because he destroys the innocent and the wicked. And so even if I am righteous, I can't stand against him because he destroys both. Then in verse 25 through 32, he says, if I try to forget my problems or even confess my sins, God is still going to consider me guilty. And in laying these out, Job is referring to two different ways they settled arguments in court. That there was in the ancient Near East, that they had crazy ways of settling things and doing things, signing contracts and everything else. But in court, one of the standard ways they argued in court was one side presented his case, the other side presented his case, then this guy responds, this guy, and they keep going back and forth until one side is rendered speechless. And when one guy is speechless, then the other guy wins. And so Job is talking about that. He said, even if I go and argue with God in court, there's nothing I can say. I mean, because he is so mighty and so powerful, and he's done all these things, I can't argue him. I can't stand up to him. And then the second way, and I'd love to see this, the second way they settled disputes in the ancient Near East, where they wrestled. Just wrestled. And so you get two people that are arguing. Well, they go in front of like a jury, and they just have a wrestling match, and the winner's right, you know. And whoever wins the wrestling match, their statement or their side of the story is considered correct. And so Job is actually referring to both of those things because he's talking about the strength of God and the might of God. And so Job is basically saying, if I go to court with him, there's no way I can win because he's much smarter than me, and whatever he says, I'm just not going to have an answer to, and that he's going to be proven right because in the latter part of Job, God does ask Job some questions that he just, quite frankly, can't answer. And then Job says, and even if there was a wrestling match, who could handle him? I mean, here's a God that hung these constellations in space. I can't wrestle him. And so by Job saying all this, Job is saying that and here's where Job is in the wrong, because look at some of his statements. Job says that if I'm righteous, he's going to declare me guilty anyway because he destroys good and the bad. If I try to talk to him and he hears my cry, he's not really listening to me. And so what Job is saying is, Job's conclusion, God is unjust. God's not fair because God cuts off the guilty and the guiltless. And so he and again, I love the book of Job because I think it parallels a lot of our attitudes. Job never abandoned God, but his view of God got really fuzzy. It got really distorted because God's not acting the way he thought he ought to. Job still believes in this retribution. And Job is thinking, okay, I really think that God should be blessing me, but he's not. So therefore, God is unjust. God is not fair. In other words, Job said God is acting arbitrarily. He's acting capriciously. There's no rhyme or reason to it. He's just willy-nilly punishing me for no reason. So Job is not going to abandon God. He just has a really distorted picture of who God is. I always say this. I always tell people, I think that we all have a love map. And I think that our love map starts kind of being put together when we're really young. We see the way our parents interact with each other, and that gives us a view of what a husband and wife ought to look like. We see how our parents relate to us, and that gives us an idea of how parents and children ought to react. And so then when we grow up, then we look for a relationship like our parents, you know, because that's where our love map was created. That's what love looks like to us, you know. If little kids are abused, their love map gets all distorted. They don't really know what the true concept of love is supposed to look like. And so I think that's a big problem with our society is people's love maps are just all over the place. But I think the number one love map that we have is God. And I think that's why children are important. You know, we send them out to children's church every Sunday, not so they can play or that. Of course, we want them to do that and have some fun, but we want to introduce them from an early age who God is. It's very simplistic. It's very idealistic. It's not really complicated, but this is who God is. Then when they get a certain age, they come out here, they sit and they listen to more in-depth teaching, and they grow up, hopefully the idea is they know who God is. And the thing we ought to know about God is that God is not really fair. God operates on the basis of grace, which is the theme, I think, of the whole book of Job. That God works on grace. That it's not that God punishes me when I'm wrong or God blesses me when I'm right. It's just that God continually gives me things and blesses me when I don't deserve it anytime. I don't deserve it at all. And God keeps giving it to me. And so Job has this really faulty love map of who God is. And Job is very, very confused because all Job knows is, I live right. I go to temple. I go to whatever, and I'm giving alms to the poor. I'm helping my family. I'm doing everything I need. God should be blessing me, yet He's not. And so Job says, "Okay, everything I thought about God was wrong. It's not right because God is not acting like I think He ought to act." In other words, Job and all these people, and it was a pretty common theme in the patriarchal period. Every one of these people defined God by what they thought He ought to be like, instead of looking at God for who He is and then patterning their lives after that. They wanted to shape God into who they thought He ought to be. And when God doesn't match what you think He ought to be, then it leads to a lot of disillusionment. It leads to a lot of despair, a lot of heartache, a lot of problem. And that's what Job is facing right now. He believes in God. And I think he loves God. I think he just has a really poor idea of who God is at this point, and he's blaming God for doing things that God never told him He was going to do. God's not trying to live up to some kind of end of the bargain or anything, and so that's where Job gets himself in trouble. If you let's see. Let me see if I can close out chapter 9 real quick. My glasses just broke. Well, I can't hear. My glasses broke. It's not a good night. Verse 25 through 35. He's just talking about the unfairness of God. Now look at verses 32 and 33, and this is where I want to end this, because this is. And I did a sermon series on Job one time, and I titled this I Need an Umpire, because Job's whole thing is, Job says, I'm very frustrated with God because in his scenario, Job is saying, I am in a court of law. God is my judge in this court of law. He's also the opposing attorney. And so Job says, I can't get a fair shake out of this because the other guy I'm going up against in court is also the judge of the case. So I'm out of luck. So in the last part of chapter 9, Job says, I wish I had somebody impartial. I wish somebody outside of me and God would come in and mediate this thing, help us out. It's kind of like when you're a kid playing baseball and you got a full team, but it's just the kids out on a sandlot somewhere, which, by the way, The Sandlot, best movie ever made. So if you've never seen it, watch The Sandlot. You're killing me, Smalls, But when you're out there playing baseball like that, you got a catcher, you got a pitcher, you got a batter, and the pitcher throws it. Well, the kids are calling the balls and strikes. So the kid that's batting, right down the middle, he says, that's a ball. So as kids out playing, in the sandlot, you're thinking, we need an umpire out here. We need somebody to mediate this thing. Or when you're playing basketball and you call your own fouls, there are some kids that just, knock you to the ground. And they say, I didn't foul you, but you're calling your own foul. You need an umpire. You need an impartial third party to come in. And Job said, that's what I need. I need somebody else to come in and negotiate this because God's not treating me fair. He's opposing me, and He's also the judge. That's not right. And so as we get through this, he's going to basically come to realize that he's wrong. and that he doesn't need anybody else, that God is perfectly capable of doing what he needs to do. Any questions about that? We'll pick over verse 10 or chapter 10 next week. Any questions?